50-degree February afternoon. I know some of you would probably rather be out gardening right now, but I appreciate you tuning into our discussion today. Presenting today on low maintenance natural landscapes for a neighborly garden. And we'll talk about what that means. So a few key points about our discussion today, and I really truly mean this as a discussion, albeit one-sided in this format, but a discussion that I'm hoping that you can carry forward in your neighborhoods and with your community groups, with your friends, your family, your neighbors, about some of the conventions and things that we look at in the landscape. Apart from my work here at the university in Extension as a horticultural educator and outreach specialist, as Julie mentioned, I've also have 28 years of experience in the landscape design build industry. So I experience landscapes in many different ways every day. And this is just kind of a snapshot of some perspective that I have, and I'd like to share with you today. So some key points we're going to cover today is what is a low maintenance landscape? What are some of the conventions that we deal with in our typical landscapes today? What are the misconceptions of those landscapes, and what are some alternatives? What are some of the costs of conventional versus natural landscapes? You know, there's lots of costs that go into how we landscape versus maybe a more natural landscape. And a couple of those things are the time versus money quotient, which I'll get into, and the price we pay, both economically, physically, mentally, and that sort of aspect. And then the what if, landscaping the natural ways. So what if we turned our convention on our head and started looking at natural landscapes or our conventional landscapes in a more natural way? So we'll talk about some basic design elements of natural landscapes, some of the environmental benefits. I will say right here that if you were tuning in today for a master class on designing with natives in a natural landscape and native plant selection, that's not this talk. That talk, as you might have seen in our previous slides, will be with myself and Lisa Johnson, our horticultural extension outreach specialist from Dane County, on March 20th. So I encourage you all to tune into that if you really want to dig deep into the design principles and how we apply those in the landscape. Today, we're going to kind of just do a brief overview of some of those elements. And finally, what neighborly gardening, what does it mean to be a good neighbor? What are some of the impacts of conventional landscaping practices on our neighbors, on our environments? What is our responsibility? What are the ethics? What can we do to be better neighbors? What can we do to be better stewards of our land? So those are just a few of the things that we're going to touch on today. So we'll kick it off by low maintenance landscapes. What does that really mean? Like I said, as a landscape professional of 28 years working in the design build industry, I work with hundreds of clients a year, quite literally. Quite often, most of my work is in the residential area. I do some commercial design, but I really like residential. That's really where my passion lies. I joke with my friends and family that I'm working to beautify the world one backyard at a time. But really what I try to do every day is share knowledge and try to break down some of these conventions. So as I'm working with these clients, mostly, as I said, residential clients, almost the number one request I get from every client is low maintenance. Before we talk about patios or flowers or shrubs or garden beds or vegetable gardening, it's low maintenance. And so let's talk about what that really means. Low maintenance landscapes, you know, really it means different things to different people. But overall, when I talk to these clients, low maintenance to me means, or to them, to the average person, is less time pruning, trimming, working those deciduous shrubs, trees, evergreen shrubs. Less time watering, less time weeding, less time just generally working in the garden to maintain an overall aesthetic. We don't have enough time. People's lives are busy, and the average homeowner tends to see the landscape as a chore, and we'd like to take that away and look at it in a little different light. So low maintenance landscapes means different things to different people. But what we end up with often are landscapes that look like this. These are very typical, at least Midwest United States landscapes. These are the homes that I visit every day. The conventional front yard landscape, really, this has been our convention since the early 1900s. We like big open spaces, minimal plantings. I think people often attribute minimal plantings to low maintenance, and that's really not always the case. These landscapes tend to be highly manicured. More turf space means less biodiversity. Monoculture plantings of one type of shrub or a hedgerow of shrub or monoculture of large spaces of turf grass reduces the overall biodiversity of the landscape. And as I mentioned, they're high maintenance. So a lot of time and effort and work goes into keeping this type of landscape looking its best year round. So where does that come from? As I mentioned, really beginning in the 19th century, and really, taking a cue from the early 18th century as formal gardens, garden clubs, golf associations, the Department of Agriculture really began pushing what the American convention is, the American lawns, a carpet of green. Instead of rolling out the red carpet to your friends and neighbors, you're rolling out the green carpet with a whole front yard of turf. I I've had a lot of experience, as I said, in the landscape design business, and I think one of the biggest tragedies, besides the loss of the front porch in our buildings these years, is really the lack of use of front lawns. They really have become more of a just general display place versus a place to really interact, a place to foster biodiversity, a place to bring in wildlife, to support pollinators. And really, so this idea, this convention was really pushed so that, you could have that American dream. But really, is this really what we want for our American dream? It really leaves us with more of the same. I can take you through any neighborhood, any suburban neighborhood, and even a lot of urban neighborhoods across much of the Midwest. And these are the conventional landscapes you're going to see. Highly manicured evergreens, lawns that need to be mowed once a week. So this in my mind, and what I want to share with you today is these landscapes are really not low maintenance, and we've been kind of sold a bill of goods with some of these concepts. So where does that come from? And what are our misconceptions that have been fed by these conventions that have been pushed by certain aspects of the green industry? On the left, we have your typical conventional landscape, large spaces of turf speckled with a handful of trees, maybe a handful of bushes, maybe a few flowering plants here and there. Versus on the right, the more natural landscape, the prairie meadow gardens, the wildflower gardens, even native shrubs and tree plantings, more woodland type of gardens. So there's misconceptions of both of these spaces. And when the average person takes a look at these spaces, what they think in their minds, again on the left with our conventional, is that these spaces are neat and clean and tidy. Well, that might be true, but it takes a lot of work and effort to make them that way. And there, as I mentioned earlier, they're often biological desert or ecological deserts for beneficial insects, for pollinators, for wildlife. Just the environmental impacts are very low, and the economic inputs are really high. We spend a lot of time and money keeping these landscapes looking pristine. Versus on the right, when we look at a more natural native landscape, more of a native prairie meadow, The initial conception in most people's minds is, wow, that's a messy, wild, untamed sort of space. Well, that's because we've been programmed to think that way. And really, these spaces, when done right and once established, have incredible biodiversity, have incredible environmental impact with in many different ways. They support pollinators, they support wildlife. When done in urban areas or suburban areas, they create corridors and spaces for these pollinators and wildlife to move through the landscape in an easier fashion. If we go back to the left and think about pollinators and wildlife trying to move across some of these conventional landscapes, it is sort of like walking across a desert for them, and it doesn't really support them in the ways that they needed to be supported. Back to the natural landscape. Another aspect of this is, again, as I mentioned, after they're established, the long-term economic impacts and inputs are relatively low. Most of these spaces need very little attention and very little support from humans in the long run. So let's talk again about a little bit of this myth busting. I think, again, we've been fed a convention that natural landscapes lower property values because they're messy and unattractive and untidy. I think, again, when done right and designed right, the reality really is as when we talk to developers and realtors, the effect on a more natural landscape is that they have a positive effect on property values. As I mentioned, developers, realtors, they actually are looking for that curb appeal. That's besides low maintenance, that may be number two for the number, for the most requested aspects of what I do is curb appeal. And so developers, realtors are often marketing these more natural landscapes or a little higher than the common conventional landscape when selling a home or selling a property. Again, we're bringing in more natural features, woodland corridors, prairie meadows, strengthen, pollinator diversity, as I mentioned, as well as other economic benefits like reduced stormwater runoff, improved habitat, improved just soil conditions in general. So we need to break down some of these myths and conventions and start reimagining what our American landscape should maybe really look like. So let's talk about some of these landscape practices and how they affect our day-to-day lives. Here are some common scenes you'll see driving around in the summertime in most Midwestern towns. I'm not as familiar with East Coast and West Coast, but West Coast is dealing with drought issues. And so there's, again, advantages to natural landscapes. If they work with native plants, they're reducing some of those costs. But around here, we talk about irrigation. We talk about the costs of mowing. We talk about the costs of pruning. We talk about hiring lawn and garden services to come out and treat our lawns for pests and weeds and other sorts of management types. We spend a lot of time in the fall collecting leaves. And these conventional landscapes just don't relate to what most people really, really want, which is low maintenance because of the high inputs and the high costs that are associated with these things. But this is the convention we know. This is what most people imagine when they imagine their home and their landscape. So again, how does that really impact us? The green industry is a big business. So along with, this convention being sort of promoted to the American society, along with that comes the economic inputs and economic impacts of what that really means. It's big business. Just in Wisconsin alone, the green industry, landscaping industry is a $3.1 billion industry. That's pretty significant. As far as businesses and employment, that's wonderful. I think regardless of conventional versus natural landscapes, there's always going to be a place for people like me, designers, people who do maintenance, albeit maybe in a little different way, people who are implementing these landscapes. There's always going to be support for that in the landscape industry. So changing convention from convention to natural, I don't think is really going to have would long term have a huge impact on employment or that sort of aspect. Now let's look at the broader impact. If we think about just the United States alone, the green industry is a $129 billion industry and only growing. It grows at about a rate of about 5% per year. So it's big business. And so there's a lot of influence out there to keep you in that conventional mode, sell you fertilizers, sell you lawn goods, sell you mosquito sprays, all these things that if we took a different approach and approached it from a little bit more natural landscape, maybe we could reduce some of those impacts and yet not impact, maybe our overall workforce. So this is a discussion I have with my clients quite regularly when we talk about low maintenance and what they really want out of their landscapes. It's what I call the time versus money quotient. Realistically, we don't have enough of either in our day-to-day lives. We really don't. We're constantly in a struggle between where do we put our inputs? And when I talk with clients, that's a big discussion we have is what do they want to do as far as implementation? We have a lot of DIY or do-it-yourselfers that want to get their hands dirty and want to get involved in their landscape. And that's great. I promote that. And we have others that really want professionals to handle a bulk of the work. So I talked to them about the time money quotient because there's time invested and money invested either way. So where does that time and money go? Just a few stats here. Over 228 million Americans own some type of lawn and garden equipment, mowers, trimmers, tools, for maintaining these spaces. I often joke with my clients that if we design your landscape the right way and take a slightly more natural approach, that a weed whip in your landscape is unnecessary. You should be able to just garage sell that baby, send it packing. And that, it's going to free up time. In some instances, maybe 10 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour. It adds up. It's significant. As you can see, our next is time. The average American spends 384 hours of their lifetime mowing their lawn. Whew, I'd rather be fishing. Personally, I mow. I've set up my landscape where I mow about 3 times a year. And people look at me and think I'm crazy, but it's really just, again, a matter of changing that convention. And then we talk about the costs of what that really means to maintain that landscape that really conventionally is not low maintenance, and it can cost the average homeowner somewhere between, I've seen different stats, and I'll show you another slide in a minute here, between $500 and as much as $1,000 a year on just maintaining, including spending fertilizer. Now that doesn't include hiring lawn and garden services, a mowing service, and different types of services like that. So the time money quotient is important. And so we need to find a happy medium with that. And I think, again, what I'm trying to express is that if we start moving towards a little bit more of a natural landscape, we can break down what that means. Because really, for the average homeowner, maintenance upon maintenance and mowing that lawn on a 96-degree day is just too much. So here are some impacts of maybe moving towards a little bit more of a natural landscape and some of the reduced maintenance costs that are involved. Once established, and I like to say that because every landscape needs a time of establishment or adjustment, we need less watering, we need less mowing, and really, apart from, again, your time money quotient, maybe you prefer to hire somebody to mow your lawns, no judgment, but maybe we need less of those services. We probably need less commercial sprays and treatments to our lawn surfaces, which again has got an environmental impact. Here's another stat from the National Wildlife Federation that, again, typical homeowner spends maybe through $700 per acre per year to maintain it. A wildflower meadow, on the other hand, $30 an acre. So just to put things in perspective a little bit. Now, this is one thing I always reinforce with my clients. no garden is no maintenance. It doesn't exist. There's no such thing. Unless you live in an astroturf world, or yeah, you decide to concrete your front yard. There's even that has maintenance costs, but it just doesn't exist. So what I'm trying to share with you is that we have choices to make. So what if we started turning that convention slightly on its head and started envisioning a little different type of landscape for our average homeowner. Landscaping the natural way is maybe not practical for everyone. I know there's probably some people listening to this today saying, "Oh, that's again just too much work and it looks too wild and too busy." It isn't about turning your whole front yard into a wildlife I'm sorry, a prairie meadow, right? While that does still reduce your costs and is still more cost effective than a turf grass lawn, the idea really is to find a happy medium. And we can do that in a bunch of different ways. And this is, again, what I really push with clients and the people that I work with and talk with is there's room for turf grass in our landscape, but managed in a different way, organized in a different way. And it really comes down to bringing in more of those natural landscape plants, working with more natives, but using them in an intentional, organized way. And what that does is it reads to the average person's eye as being tidy and being manageable, because it is. And so that's really the point I want to make in this whole discussion about conventional versus natural is maybe one way or the other isn't exactly perfect, but I think there's definitely room in the middle. So as I said, I'm not going to delve too deeply. We don't really have enough time today to get into all the aspects of design principles of what a native landscape is. But here are some different considerations to take into consideration when thinking about changing your landscape. You wanna pick plants that are more native, that are work for your site, for your location. You want to think about bloom time, create a diverse mix of plants, varying bloom times. Really, I always try to stress again that we have something always in bloom from spring to fall. And then don't forget winter interest. Forms and textures, I bring that into play here because that's really what we get out of our winter interest with a lot of these plants. Again, straight organized lines, varying lines, create organized look, create a tidiness that people respect, using colors intentionally, mixing in different plant heights. And then people always are concerned about weed control. And when done right and plants are established well, weed control really isn't a huge issue. It should be maintenance for you maybe 3 times a year, spring cleanup, fall cleanup if you do that, and a handful of times during the summer potentially. So as we said, native plants, why choose native plants? Why try to work with native plants? Or as my friend Lisa would say, native Rs, there are advantages to those as well. Well, native plants obviously share a long evolutionary history with our sites, our landscapes, and therefore they have a relationship with pollinators and wildlife and really create more diverse, economically stable landscapes and ones that allow more connections between landscapes. Again, we're not putting a desert in between ecological oases per se. Another aspect that I really like to push is when we're working towards a more natural landscape and trying to find that happy medium is really be intentional. Create lines, create pathways, create destinations, really bring in that human element that people recognize and understand. And again, that means different things to different people. And when you work with someone like me who's a landscape designer, we really try to listen to all your needs and wants and really hone what works best for you. So I'm gonna kind of blow through this a little bit because we don't have a lot of time here, but this is recorded so you can reference this, and I've got a few references at the end of the webinar too, but these are just a handful of native plants that are easily acquirable, easily incorporated, bring lots of diversity, bring lots of benefits for not only pollinators, but other wildlife really throughout the growing season and even into the winter. So many of you will be familiar with a lot of this list anyway, but it's there for your reference later. I really do want to get into this neighborly discussion, as I mentioned in the beginning. And what that means is as a discussion, again, I'm hoping gets carried forward beyond just this talk, excuse me, this talk today, is what does it mean to be a good neighbor? What is our impact as a citizen in our community? What's our global impact? Stewardship. I mean, I think it really boils down to stewardship. And I think I put this little clip in here from Aldo Leopold kind of as an example of someone that really was leading the way in that area of ethics and leadership. And so what are those impacts? Wow, lots of impacts, right? Conventional landscapes lead us to a lot of garden waste. Where does it all go? What happens to it? What are the impacts on our communities? Again, the National Wildlife Federation estimates that 18% of all municipal solid waste collected is organic waste. That's grass clippings, leaf raking, branch trimming, as I've listed here. All of those materials are organic and have natural elements. Now, I can hear through the virtual world folks out there saying, well, I don't have space, or it has to get out of my yard, or I have to clean up. Well, yes and no. Those organics have benefits and can be used and reused. And not doing that fall cleanup also has some advantages too. What are the negative advantages or negative aspects of some of these equipment we use to do some of this garden cleanup? You know, noise pollution alone between mowers and leaf blowers and weed whackers and hedge trimmers, you know, they all range in decibel levels from 80 to 103 decibels. Man, that's a lot of noise when, you know, you might be out trying to enjoy some time with your family, having a lunch in the afternoon on your patio, and your neighbor is next door trying to clean up those leaves because it's fall and that's the thing to do. Maybe there's a way we can work around this. Just by comparison, the average rock concert is 90 to 100 decibels. Anything over 85 is considered potentially harmful to human beings. So I think that's one thing that we need to consider when we think about how we're affecting our neighbors and approaching landscapes from a more neighborly fashion. So as I mentioned, there's a big push, at least in our industry, the green industry, and in the horticultural world, to leave the leaves. There's a lot of benefits to that. We're adding organics back into the soils. We are providing habitat. Instead of raking them up, putting them in a garbage bag and sending them off to a landfill where, as they decompose, they might be creating and putting methane into the air, which again adds to our global greenhouse gases. Put them back into your landscape. Use a mulching mower. You know, there are benefits to not doing that fall cleanup, to not clearing all those leaves. Leaving stalks, leaving seed heads, leaving standing twigs and branches provides habitat, provides cover, provides food. You know, a lot of fruiting plants persist into the wintertime. In fact, many late fruiting plants really don't ripen until we've had a frost, and that's when the birds really like them best. But there's so many advantages to maybe not doing that fall cleanup and making everything super neat and tidy before winter. It's just another way to look at it. Another alternative is maybe you have space where you could create a little small composting bin or an area. This is great because ultimately all of those materials pay you back. It doesn't take long. It doesn't take a big space. But all of those things we talked about, leaf litter, grass clippings, certain food scraps. Again, I'm not going to get into all the basics of composting, but we've got lots of references in our extension websites on composting if you're interested. But why not use those resources we have and let them pay back. So, you know, the status quo, again, here are the impacts. Here's what we're looking at. Do we want to continue with treatments of lawns and irrigations during droughty times? We just came out with new zone hardiness maps, and climate changes has had some effect. In the last 3 years, we've gone through some of the most droughty conditions, at least in Wisconsin and southern Wisconsin, than we've maybe historically ever had. Even now, wintertime, when we're really not thinking about it, we're still in extreme drought. So with those environmental impacts affecting us, we need to rethink how we manage those. Excuse me. So maybe a little less of the convention and maybe a little less of maybe the non-conventional, and maybe let's take that to a new level. And again, it isn't about taking 3 acres and turning it all into prairie meadow. It's about starting small, starting with a small area of your yard. Reduce your turf grass by half. Really, ultimately, you will reap the benefits. You'll reap the time benefits, the economic benefits. You'll reap the beauty, the bringing birds and butterflies and pollinators all back into your landscape. And it doesn't take long. It happens relatively quickly. So the natural form plays its role. So what are some of the benefits of going from more of a natural landscape versus a conventional landscape? Really, overall, it reduces the long-term maintenance associated. As I mentioned, that time versus money quotient is real and has an impact. We never have enough of both. So maybe if we rethink the convention, we can reinvest our time and reinvest our money in other ways. Overall, these more naturalized landscapes, as I mentioned, reduce our carbon footprint. It means less lawnmowers, less weed trimmers, less fossil fuels being burned in these pieces of equipment. It reduces, just those overall inputs. The less inputs, the better. Natural landscapes, as I would hope, we can encourage, promotes the use of native plant materials. Those are the plants that are going to do the best, are going to need less herbicide treatments and fungal treatments. If we work with what's intended to be here, again, it will pay us back in more ways than I even have time to discuss today. Habitat, as I mentioned, pollinators, that's a big push. We've seen a decline in pollinators over the last couple of decades, as well as actually bird populations as well. It's amazing the impact we've had on bird populations and other beneficial insects. We're creating wildlife corridors. You'll see more and more, and actually in some urban planning, I wanted to just bring this up. I noticed recently a community in Duluth, Minnesota, recently put up wildlife corridors over their interstate highways so they could promote, the easier transition of some of these pollinators and other wildlife. Those are great ideas, and we can do that in our urban landscape by just creating small patches. As I said, you don't have to turn your whole front yard into a natural landscape. Start small. And the more folks that do this, the more corridors and connections we're going to make across the greater landscape and increase overall biodiversity. Again, breaking down the convention versus natural, let's try to find that happy medium and create landscapes that are organized and intentional, but really are done in a way that creates harmony. Again, time money quotient. If we work in a more natural landscape, we're going to have more time. You just will. Talk about neighborly approach. If we can put down that weed whip for a few hours a year, put the lawnmower back in the shed for a few hours a year, that reduction in noise pollution also has an impact, not only on our neighbors, but again, on that wildlife, on pollinators, on birds, on really everything. And overall, it's more environmentally friendly, as I've touched on several times, and potentially neighborly. So it's just a little touch here from Wild Ones. We have are fortunate to have several organizations around us besides Extension. Wild Ones is just one. Um, and there's like another one is the Xerxes Society that really have made it their mission to break down some of these conventions and really start approaching our landscape from a different perspective. Here's just a few other resources. I'm not going to go into this in too detail. As I said, this will be recorded and you can come back to this at your leisure, or feel free to reach out to any of our partners in Extension across almost every county in Wisconsin. We're all here to help and provide information. That's it. That's what I have for you today. I'd entertain any questions if we have any.
Thank you, Tim. I'd be happy to give you a few questions here in our few remaining minutes. And I thank you for your thoughtful presentation. I think lots of people appreciate the message here. I know you mentioned, this has come up a couple times, I know you mentioned kind of starting small if we're trying to transform a space. What are maybe some other tips on how to actually transform from that manicured lawn space maybe into a more natural, flower or plant space?
Well, again, I think it really starts at the garden center and or working with a professional, unless you have a great depth of knowledge, or pick up some books and really educate yourself on the natives that work best in your landscape and for what you're trying to achieve. Simple foundation plantings, really, if we use more native plants, I do a lot of residential landscaping, and sometimes it's just foundation plants. And if I even approach that aspect of the landscape from more native shrub and evergreen planting, as well as incorporating perennials into that mix, we've begun the process. That's starting small, and that's what almost every home already has, right? We have some sort of planting around our foundation. Just as a side note, grass up to your foundation is not low maintenance. Just as a side note, I see that a lot. But creating a buffer or maintenance strip there is helpful. So yeah, start small. Every little bit has an impact.
Great. There's been several questions come up about maybe how to talk to neighbors or how to talk to your local town or your governance or your municipality about some of this topic. I'm just kind of curious. I know that question comes up about where, hey, I'm trying to do this, but my neighbor is, using chemicals, or we share a space and they're using chemicals. I think part of that is to approach the topic carefully. We don't want to cause any more distress. But in your conversations with your clients and in your work, do you have anything maybe about what helps that conversation along?
Thoughtfully sharing ideas. No judgment. I mean, if a turf grass lawn is what you love and you love, I have clients that say their therapy is getting on their lawnmower and driving it around for an hour and a half or 2 hours on a Saturday morning. Great. If that works for you, that's great. But I still think there's place within that landscape to incorporate some of these more natural elements. I think intentionally working on that in your own yard, I think people notice and they might approach you with questions, or I have seen other clients in other spaces, and other garden plots use signage. I raise bees, so I have a sign in my yard that says, pardon the weeds, I'm feeding my bees. And people acknowledge me. I have a lot of folks that walk their dogs and walking by the neighborhood when I'm out working in the garden, and they'll stop and have a conversation. That's the neighborly approach. Just have those conversations. Talk about what's important to you and what you want to share. I think that's the starting point. We don't talk enough to our neighbors in that way. We might gripe about the noise. We might gripe about they just sprayed mosquito spray in their yard. But have those conversations with them. Ask them, hey, why are you doing that? What's your goal? Start
I,
there.
I think that's really great advice to approach it with some authenticity and not judgment, but also trying to have a shared and understanding and trying to come to that common place. Another question, Tim, that has come up is about invasive. So controlling those invasive weeds, do take some time and energy and maybe some mechanical power or things like that. Just any recommendations. I'm not going to get into specific invasives, but just controlling invasives in these natural landscapes as well.
Right. So this goes back to that slide. No garden is no maintenance, right? We are dealing with natural elements, the natural environment. Birds scatter seeds quite regularly. The ever-present buckthorn and ever-present honeysuckle that we deal with, at least here in Wisconsin, are impactful. But what I have noticed and what my experience is after that establishment period of creating some of these more naturalized spaces and more intentional spaces, if done well and you create massings and groupings of plants, you're really going to crowd out a lot of those invasives. Invasives can be difficult to manage. It depends upon what types, right? There's some that are impossible and some that go away pretty easily if you just take a little bit of time to manage those. We try to encourage not using chemical sprays if possible. What you'll find with many invasives, if you get to them before bloom time or before they go to seed, removing them by hand is really highly effective. We've got a bunch of handouts through Extension on managing invasives if you're interested in more in depth on those types of things. But again, start small, work in what's manageable for you, and overall that'll reduce the inputs that you're putting in, again, both mechanically and your time, and just overall costs.
Thank you, Tim. I want to thank everybody for your time today. Again, you can review this recording. We'll have it up in a few days. And if you have questions, we do have a Ask a Gardening Question form. If your question didn't get answered or other questions come up during the growing season, fill out that form from the Extension Horticulture website, and that will get directed to a staff or volunteer to answer your specific question and customize it for you. I appreciate everybody's time and have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.